Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique Gift of Destiny and how to relate it to other elements of the American Kenpo system. So keep in mind that this is not a comprehensive list and it is not family groupings. The better way to think about it is just different avenues that you can explore so that we can uncover some of the foundations of American Kenpo. So let's start out this relationship through a concept that a lot of people know, but know in a different manner. And that would be maneuvers are added as needed. So most people understand it as foot maneuvers are added as needed, but it's just a small concept in a larger concept. Maneuvers are added as needed. So let's get into that as we get going forward. So let's start out with the perspective of positioning, and that'll pull in that foot maneuver as added as needed piece. So let's start out with something like obscure sword. So if we look at obscure sword, the ideal phase of it, we're doing the step, we're doing the chop, we're doing the kick, and then we're doing the step back. So what is the purpose of this step back? The purpose of the step back is to begin disengaging and creating distance between us and our opponent, and the ideal phase would then cross out and cover. But as Kenpoists, we like to do things a little bit more efficiently. So we can do that in this case. We can do the step, we can do the chop, we can do the kick, but then since we know we're going to be disengaging, what we can do is add the pull drag in order to start that process much more efficiently than we would just stepping and crossing out. So let's do the opposite of that. So in this case, we went backwards rather than forward, so that the reverses of one another, and then rather than disengaging, we could do re-engagement or stay engagement. And that would bring in something like the obscure claws, where normally what would happen is they would stay here and we'd just do the hit. But what happens if I hit and they begin to create distance between me and them? Well, this is where that concept comes in. I have to add the foot maneuver as needed, in this case going forward rather than reverse, and to stay engaged rather than disengaged. Okay, so now up to now we've done adding foot maneuvers or added as needed. Well, guess what the opposite of that would be? Deleting foot maneuvers as needed. So if we look at the ideal phase of deflecting hammer, we do this block, we do the pin, and then we do this push drag or step drag forward to get to the proper range to the elbow. But what happens if we're really good at the frictional pull, the blocking in this case, or they're overcommitted? Well, guess what happens? We need to delete the foot maneuver because we're already at the proper range for the elbow. So rather than adding foot maneuvers are added as needed, in this case, we're deleting foot maneuvers as needed. Now, let's carry this forward a little bit more and take it away from just foot maneuvers. Hand maneuvers can be added as needed. So in this case, let's talk through it in base technique, Gift of Destiny. So if we go through the ideal phase, when we get to this flapping elbow piece here, we're supposed to keep the hands engaged. But through a variety of different reasons, we may have to disengage those hands. Or in this case, what I'm doing is applying more of a lock. But this could be also done through changes in height. But notice what happened. This is the important piece. The fact that our hands got disengaged. Well, guess what? We have to re-engage them. So this is where hand maneuvers are added as needed. So in this case, we're going to take the target and bring it back to our weapon. Okay, so that does it through positioning. Let's move on to a different lens or a different way of looking at this through defensive purposes. So let's start out with that obscure sword again. So we go through the ideal phase. We do not pin the hand, their hand with our hand. We cover. And we do this for a couple different reasons, one of which is fixed spatial positioning. So what does that mean? That means when I do the step and I begin to do the cover, my hand stays in position. If I were to put it on their hand, that means it's going to be pulled further and further away from that potential need for that right hand. Let's show that in reality. So what would happen is by having the hand here and the punch comes in, I can continue to do the chop and do this as a block. But there's another option here. What happens if they're really quick? My hand comes up, I begin to step, I start getting away, but I notice I can't turn towards the opponent. Well, I can always use the right hand and convert the left hand into an offense. Okay, so look at it from the other relation we did, obscure claws. The ideal phase is very similar. We do the claw and we do the claws. We're doing hits, right? So what happens if they were really quick, like it was in obscure sword? Well, guess what? I might have to do both of these claws as defense, or one of them and then turn the other one into an offense, or, very similar to what we did in the previous technique, I can start out with the proper claw, but then the other claw that's going to come in, because the hand is too fast, I have to turn in a new defensive maneuver instead of the claw and the offensive maneuver, which we had to do. Okay, so up to now, we've been doing it on the top part. We can now move this to the bottom part, talk through something like thrusting salute. If you notice thrusting salute, the ideal phase, you do the block, you do the kick, and do the hit. But guess what? There's that potential of walking into a hand. We didn't cover up that there major right hand. So what do? We add a defense as needed in order to do that hit and finish our technique. Notice it's as needed. They may or may not do that punch, but it's always best to do it as needed. Reverse that motion, get into position so you get that fixed spatial positioning and getting that cover in place. So now that we've done it through the low end, let's bring it back to the upper end and talk about how we're going to do it here from a defensive manner. So normally what we would do is we step in here and start this elbow. But again, just like in the previous ones, what if they're too fast? What if I get into here and I'm starting to do this? I might end up eating that fist. Don't want to do that. So what do? But what we might want to do here is convert this into a defense. And this is where we bring in another possibility of where we might have to disengage those hands again. Okay? So now that we looked at it from a defensive lens, let's move this into an offensive lens. Okay? So let's bring it back into Gift of Destiny. We have this original touch here, which is with the middle knuckle, and you would say touch. This brings in the rule of don't touch what you can hit. So normally what we don't do is go into a grab and do the lock. What we want to do is we want to insert this middle knuckle to obey that rule of don't touch what you can hit. And if we bring it in here into this flapping elbow, you would say, well, how is that added as needed in an offensive manner? Well, talk about what we were doing earlier, something like the defensive, where I might have to bring this up and I can't do that. Or let's say I want to just do this part with the wrist lock and leave that out. I can do it as needed, in this case, from the middle knuckle, trying to help or aid what's going on here with the hand. We have something very similar in this case, something like Defying the Storm, where we do this insert in order to get the opponent not thinking about the weapon. Okay, so we can then bring this into the outside of the left. If you look at up to now, we've been doing everything on that right hand. We don't always have to do it with that right hand. We can do the opposite. And that would bring in something like a shield and sword, where rather than just bringing the hand out and getting ready to do the chop, what we can do is do the insert with an eye slice in order to get ready to do that chop. So up to now, we've been doing the top, left and right. We can also start moving on to the bottom, horizontal and vertical. And that would bring in something like Thunder and Hammers, where they do the punch, I get in here to do the strike. Well, guess what? I can start doing knees here on that horizontal rather than not only relying upon my upper body and my hands, okay? But notice what I said, horizontal and vertical. That brings in something like a striking serpent's head, where I get in here to do this strike, and normally we just set up to do this hit. Well, guess what? We can now do that knee also on a vertical, rather than the horizontal line, and a single rather than a double. Okay, let's do one more. I know this is long, but we'll do one more. Locking and breaking. You should know that the difference between a lock and a break is the amount of power that you apply. Less amount of power means locking, more power means breaking. So how does that fit into here? So we look at the beginning of the technique. We could normally just do a lock, and we could then turn it into a break by adding more power. But we can then take this to the end of the technique also, where we now do an explicit break and then followed by a lock, where we can turn this into a lock or this into a break, depending upon how we apply the power at that point. We can then move this into a different technique, something like a circling destruction, where we're going against the arm out up rather than down. So we get into here, we do this break here. Then we can add an insert here, because now we're crossing center lines. And then we get to this piece to where normally the ideal phase is just do the hit and the chop. Well, guess what? You can now go into the neck too and get into a lock, okay? Or a break, depending upon the amount of pressure. And let's look at from the opposite side here, backbreaker and Dance of Darkness, where you normally just go into the eyes, but guess what? I can add an insert here, get into that arm, and get in either a hyperextension, which would be a lock, or a break. And then similar to what we did in Circling Destruction, we can also turn this into a break or a lock here on the neck. Okay, So that's enough for this video. So in recap, how did we relate this technique? Through maneuvers are added as needed, not just foot maneuvers are added as needed. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.